projector starts, and so begins this episode of Movie Nights and Matinees, the podcast for people who enjoy movies from when we actually had to go to the movies. I'm your host, Bill Groves, and this is episode 11, A Picture is Worth 1,000 Faces, in which my guest and I go back to the early years of Hollywood and look at the life and career of one of its original superstars.
Say, Pop, there's a great new joke going around school. Don't step on that spider. It might be Lon Chaney.
Number was dedicated to the Smithsonian Institute and several other scientific bodies who seem to be trying very hard to find out who and what this fellow Chaney really is. Now, personally, I doubt very much that there is a Lon Chaney. Oh, I've seen lizards and spiders and Chevrolets running around. However, I still maintain that Lon Chaney is merely a myth.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for listening. If you've been listening for a while, then you know that most of my guests have been film historians who have authored books on various movie topics. I've been hoping to go beyond that and have as guests people who have actually worked in cinema, either behind or in front of the camera. I'm happy to say that my guest today fits that bill. In fact, you could say he pretty much wins the trifecta. For while he can lay claim to having worked in the movies as an actor as well as being an award-winning makeup artist, he is in addition a film historian and author, with one of his primary subjects being that of silent screen star Lon Chaney. With me today to talk about Chaney, as well as some of his own Hollywood experiences and recollections, is Michael F. Blake. Michael, welcome to Movie Nights and Matinees.
I'm happy to be here.
Well, this is going to be fun because this is the first chance I've had to have an actual conversation with you. We met, I doubt you remember, because I'm sure it was more significant for me at the time, knowing who you were versus someone you just ran into. But I met you at one of the Ray Quartz Hollywood Collectors shows.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ray Quartz, boy, that goes back a long way.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually, when I was doing my magazine Television Chronicles, that was a good place to meet and be able to arrange interviews with a number of people that I interviewed for the magazine later. The one that immediately comes to mind is James Hong.
My dad and I worked with him on the next to last Kung Fu that aired in 1974.
Well, that's a good segue because not only, as I mentioned in the intro, have you worked as an actor, but you're following in your dad's footsteps there. Your dad was a very prolific character actor over a good number of years. So
40 years.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking about Lon Chaney, and this might be jumping ahead a little bit, but the screen biography that was made of his life, Man of 1,000 Faces, starring my favorite dramatic actor from that era, James Cagney. I was looking in the credits, and by golly, there was your dad.
Listen to them. They're stamping holes in the floor.
Where's Cleaver? Dressing. One song while we get set up for the acrobats, and she's never ready. I paid a lot of money for this curtain. I pay your wife to stay in front of it. All right, you made your point.
Yeah, well, that's how it started. Literally, Man of 1,000 Faces changed my life. I know a lot of people, people say that a movie changed my life, and a lot of people kind of, I don't know, I guess they kind of think it kind of a cliche, but it really did because it introduced me to Lon Chaney and it introduced me to makeup. And when the movie was over, I wanted to know more about Lon Chaney and I wanted a makeup case. This was in 1968. August of 1970, I was doing a part on Marcus Welby. I played Glenn Corbett's son. And I got to be really good friends with one of the makeup artists, Dick Dawson. And, I was going through his case saying, well, what's this? What's this? How do you do this? How do you do that? Because I thought there were all these neat toys. I didn't realize a lot of it was painting, highlights and shadows. And one day he took me up to the makeup lab, and up on the wall are all these plaster casts of people like Cagney and Lon Jr. and Brock Hudson, you name it. They were anybody that had worked at Universal probably since the late 40s had a plaster cast there. And then on one wall was about a dozen photos from Man of a Thousand Faces, which for me was like a kid in a candy store because a lot of them were behind the scenes shots. And just sitting underneath that on a hanger, believe it or not, was the upper portion of the old Creature from the Black Lagoon suit. And it was all glued onto a scuba upper portion for the torso, arms and chest and that. It was all glued to that with I think they said it was rubber cement or something. But there it was still there.
Wow.
And on my last day, he came up to me and he goes, "Are you good at fixing things?" Now, I'm 13 years old and I'm on a set with a whole crew that can build literally anything they need to, right? But in typical fashion as an actor, I said, "Of course." So he took me over to the makeup table and he said, "Here, this is yours." And he gave me his old makeup case. Now, his old makeup case he used when he was an apprentice working at Universal. And one of the films he worked on was Man of a Thousand Faces.
Okay.
We went home and made up all the kids in the neighborhood with a Cary Grant tan and started practicing. I got a Richard Corson's 5th edition book of stage makeup and started playing with that. And when I got out of high school, I took a makeup class. Mike Westmore it was his last class. He had just finished doing Rocky, and it was a stage makeup class he taught. I went up to Universal in '77 to show Dick Dawson my portfolio. And he and Dorothy Andre, the hairstylist, God bless her, before she became a hairstylist, she was a stunt lady. And she doubled Olivia de Havilland in a movie called Adventures of Robin Hood.
I may have heard of that one.
The de Havilland were some of the first people to ride a Palomino horse that became known as Trigger before Roy Rogers. Anyway, she said to Dick, "Take him in to show Nick Marcelino, the head of the makeup department." Now, to get in to see Nick Marcelino, I had a better chance of meeting the President of the United States on a whim. So he took me in, introduced me to Nick. I shoved my portfolio under Nick's nose. He gets halfway through it. He said, "Okay, let's stay in touch." About 6 months later, October 24th, 1978, not that I remember the date, I walked red doors at Universal and started my career as a makeup artist. And I spent my first 3.5 years at Universal, and I was perfectly happy to stay there the rest of my life. I was very happy there. But after the Screen Actors Guild strike in 1980, the pencil pushers started looking at things, and they wound up closing the makeup and hair department. They closed the camera department. They got rid of the special effects department. Basically, they became a rental lot. And so I had to go and freelance. And I did that. And in June of 2018, after 40 years, I pulled the pin and said that was enough and retired.
Wow. And just to make sure I'm keeping the chronology straight in my head, your original visit to the Universal makeup department there, where you saw all the stills of Man of a Thousand Faces, you said that was 1970. So that was a couple of years after you had actually seen the film.
Yeah, I saw it in April of 1968 because I stayed up to watch my dad. In LA at the time, the CBS station on Saturday nights had what they called the Fabulous 52. They showed movies every Saturday night for 52 weeks. And it happened to be the LA premiere of the station running Man of a Thousand Faces. And there was a commercial on during the week. And Dad said, "Oh, I'm in that." So I got to stay up because it started at 11:30. And I got to stay up to watch Dad. And like I said, when it was over, it was like, "Who's Lon Chaney? I want a makeup case." And unfortunately, there were no books at the time in '68 written about Chaney. That didn't happen until 1971 when Robert G. Anderson brought out his book, Faces, Forms, Films, The Artistry of Lon Chaney. Then, of course, there was a couple of others that were, Forey Ackerman did one, which I call an abortion. It has a lot of photos, but improperly captioned. A lot of them have his childish puns, which doesn't really do service to Chaney's talent and ability. it was a mess, let's put it that way. From a photographic point, yeah, it was nice to see some of these photos, but then he'd take the same photo and crop it and just stuff like that. And I was working with Burt Lancaster on Tough Guys, and we got talking about Lon Chaney one day. And I started telling him stuff, and he said, you need to write a book. And I said, well, I'm not a writer. He says, well, then find somebody. And I went through it. I found one guy that he wanted to do a book on Chaney, and I thought we'd be sharing credit, which I was fine with. And he insisted, oh, no, I'm getting sole credit because I need it. And I said, now I'm doing all the financing, doing all the research, all that stuff. And I said, I don't think so. So I took my dad's old vaudeville advice and I started a solo act. I wrote 3 pages, and they were the most god-awful pieces of crap I ever wrote. I tried to sound biographical. It was dull, it was boring, it was lifeless. I still have those pages to remind me of where I started from. And a friend gave me really great advice. She said, you talk so well about Chaney, like you and he were old friends, because you know so much. She says, write it that way. And really, my inspiration came from Kevin Brownlow, the great film historian, because you read any of his books on film history, and I highly recommend all of them. He does not talk down to the reader. He carries it as a genuine conversation with you and lures you in and takes you along on this great ride. And that's what I tried to do. And I did my first draft, and then before we got married, my soon-to-be wife and I went through it, and she didn't know as much as I did, which was great, because suddenly she'd go, well, what does this mean? Because I had been talking in shorthand, I'd say a certain term that I knew, but I forgot that regular readers outside of the business, they may not be aware of it. So you had to go back and explain what that meant or what this meant. So she really helped me and put the book together. And in 1993, the first book came out.
And the title of that one was?
Lon Chaney, The Man Behind 1,000 Faces.
Now, and again, I'm jumping back a little bit here. At what point did you see your first Lon Chaney film?
I would have seen, would have been 1969. It was a kind of snowy reception from the local PBS station in Los Angeles. There was an old series that PBS ran called The Toy That Grew Up, and they would show silent films. Well, they were showing Shadows with Lon Chaney, where he plays this Chinaman who washes ashore. And I was fascinated that, wait a minute, this is Lon Chaney? This guy is Lon Chaney. He doesn't look like Lon Chaney. He doesn't act like Lon Chaney. He doesn't walk like Lon Chaney. And it just fascinated me. And then we had a great guy, newscaster, kind of storyteller on the CBS station in LA back then called Ralph Story. And he had a show every Sunday night called Ralph Story's Los Angeles. It was a half hour. And in 1970, he did one on Lon Chaney. So I then got to see a clip from The Trap, of course, clips from Hunchback and Phantom, because basically he showed whatever was public domain. Couldn't show the MGM features because you'd have to pay a fee. And then for my 14th birthday, my dad rented me Phantom of the Opera. And I had it Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. It was a 16 millimeter print. I must have ran it at least 6 times. We had a movie theater in LA called the Silent Movie Theater.
Sure.
They would show, again, Chaney public domain films, films that in the early 20s that had fallen into public domain, like The Hunchback and The Phantom of the Opera, Shadows, The Shock, things like that. None of the MGM jewels were shown because of the price. So I got to see a lot of those. Then in 1974, another PBS station out of Chicago, I think it was, they had made a deal with a bunch of MGM films and put scores together. Some were not so great. But they showed, aside from a couple of Garbo films, they showed Chaney in He Who Gets Slapped, the first movie produced by MGM, The Unholy Three Silent, The Monster, which admittedly isn't one of my favorite films, and West of Zanzibar, which was a real corker. And that means good. So I slowly started. And then, of course, with the burst of VHS films, a lot of bootleg prints started showing up. And some were really good prints and some were pretty hard to watch because they were all washed out. But, a washed out Chaney film you hadn't seen was better than nothing. So by then I pretty much got to see almost everything by the mid 80s. And I managed to get some of these on video, and would watch them. And then, of course, once Turner Classic Movies came around and our cable company started carrying it, wow, every Sunday night a silent movie. Yeah, I pray that that never changes. It allows a lot of people that have never seen silent films to see them properly.
Right. Yeah, that TCM was sort of the culmination. I say culmination as if it's over and done with, but even within the last week, I've been watching some Chaney films that I had not seen before. But my early exposure to Chaney, I was thinking back on this. What was my first exposure? And ironically, it was, I think, back in the 60s, the old Aurora model kits.
Oh, yeah.
That they used to have all the Universal monsters. And there was a family that lived across the street from us. And they had, there were three brothers, part of that family. And I don't know which one or ones of them had done this, but they had the whole lineup. They had a bookcase. It was like a legal bookcase in a family room area. And up on across the top were all these assembled, painted models. So that was my first look at Phantom of the Opera. Hunchback of Notre Dame, although I think at that time, at least I remember the boxes for those had that great artwork on them. And I think at that time they had shifted and they were using the Anthony Quinn image, at least on the box. Now, I don't remember if that impacted the model itself.
The Hunchback model was kind of Quinn makeup. It wasn't really a replica of Chaney. That artwork, by the way, was done by the great Western artist James Bama.
Oh, really? Okay.
And he also there was a paperback version of Bob Thomas's book on Thalberg that I bought. And he did the artwork on it. And it had Thalberg standing between Harlow and I think it was Garbo. And it was like, it was like looking at a photograph. That's how good his artwork was.
Yeah.
But the Phantom model, he based the artwork more off of Cagney's makeup in Man of a Thousand Faces and also the model itself is based more like Cagney's makeup than it is Chaney's.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I don't know why. I guess maybe it was easier access to do that than to do Chaney's. But my God, over the last, 20 years, some of these folks that do these garage kits, as they call them, they've done some great Phantom of the Opera and Hunchback models that are just great recreation of Chaney's work.
So starting, again, going back to my own experience with discovering Chaney, there was that was close. And then move into the 70s and I start reading, you mentioned Forrest Ackerman. Well, I started reading Famous Monsters. And so that was my first exposure to a number of other roles that he had played in the silent era. Oh, and there was also in high school, there was this kid who, as I was discovering silent films that were available to be checked out from the public library, but my emphasis was mostly comedy stuff, Chaplin, Keaton, Harold Lloyd, that sort of thing. But I also was able to see 8mm print Hunchback of Notre Dame, Phantom of the Opera, that sort of thing. And there was a kid in high school who was a big Chaney fan. But other than seeing titles in the Blackhawk catalog, which I couldn't really afford to order much of anything from, it was still fun to flip through it, I didn't know that much about the films. And then fast forward a number of years, you mentioned TCM. They had a Chaney marathon at one point, and I rolled VHS tape after VHS tape, getting a lot of those films. Mr. Wu, Tell It to the Marines, I think West of Zanzibar, both versions. Well, at least one version of Unholy Three. I'm not sure if I saw both at that point. So that was a huge leap forward in my knowledge of Chaney. But for people who even now are as I was back then, and really they only know Chaney, they've heard his name, they've probably seen images from Hunchback of Notre Dame, Phantom of the Opera, London After Midnight, that sort of thing, but they really don't know much of anything else. How would you describe Lon Chaney to such people?
He was Hollywood's greatest character actor.
The actor is a very special human being. There are only a few who possess his peculiar magic, that extraordinary ability to make us feel, to lift us out of our own existence and make us believe in the world of make-believe. I'm speaking of the great ones now, those that audiences have selected and set apart. Such a one was Lon Chaney.
My publisher did a great thing on my first Chaney book. She had a poster made of the book cover, which has Lon with all these faces. And I've gone recently talking to kids in an elementary school about film makeup. And I bring this poster and I say, you see all these faces? They go, yeah, a lot of it, they're really amazed at stuff. They're pointing out things. And I said, that was all one man. And he did all that makeup. That's how I open up talking about Lon to them. Of course, the marathon that you were talking about of Chaney films, that was probably in 2000 when Kevin Brownlow's wonderful documentary, which I was so lucky to be a part of, aired.
That's right. I remember that now because I remember, along with all the Chaney features, I recorded that documentary.
And look, you can't get better than Kevin Brownlow. My God, anybody listening, go to YouTube and look up Hollywood, A Celebration of Silence. It's about 13 episodes about the silent era. And my God, you want to talk about what a documentary should be like? That's it.
Yeah.
Kevin is the Rolls Royce when it comes to cinema documentaries.
Yeah, his Buster Keaton, A Hard Act to Follow, is at the top of my list too.
Oh, yeah. And even the Universal Horrors, which was kind of out of his comfort zone, but still did an excellent job. And the fact that he knew so many of these people. I mean, when we were doing the documentary, and I remember one time we going around town shooting like Chaney's home here and this and that. We stopped for lunch one day, and there was about four of us sitting there. And Kevin, I asked him a question about somebody, and he just started telling the story. And it led from one story to another to another. The man knew all these people. He talked with all these people. If anybody wants to learn about silent film, there are 3 Kevin Brownlow books you must, and I repeat, you must read. The Parade's Gone By, which is what inspired me to become a film historian. The War, the West, the Wilderness, which last I checked, you can get it. I have it on my iPad through, I think it was iTunes. And The Mask of Innocence, which is still in paperback. And it's also available as an iBook. But oddly enough, Kevin's Parade's Gone By hasn't been put into an iBook. And I've got to ask him why can't they do it? But my God, those books, it's a treasure trove. It's a treasure trove of film history. And he knew so many of these people. He knew how things were made. And it's just a great trip down memory lane. Of course, he fills it with photos that, especially Parade's Gone By, which came out in 1968, nobody had seen most of these photos, not to mention knowing some of these people. There's a great piece that I always love reading. He interviewed Joseph Henneberry, who later became a director, but he played Lincoln in Griffith's Birth of a Nation. And there's a couple of paragraphs there where Henneberry is explaining how he made himself up and the filming of it and the difficulties with the makeup. As a makeup person, I always go back and I'd read that because it just was a wonderful piece of history that is now not lost. That's the sad thing is, and I kick myself sometimes, if I could go back in my lifetime and go back and sit down and talk with these people more about what they did, because when I first started, all I was interested in was Lon Chaney. If you worked with Lon Chaney, I wanted to know about Lon Chaney. Then as I got older, and my interest, I started expanding. Of course, I wanted to know if you worked with John Ford, I'd talk your ear off about John Ford. And then just talking with people. Last night, my wife and I were watching Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I was pointing out to her the scene where Indiana Jones goes under the German truck. Well, that was my stuntman friend, Terry Leonard. And I was telling her about how they shot it, how they did it. And then I was reminiscing that on the recent Johnny Depp Lone Ranger movie. we were filming something in the parking lot of Santa Anita. They had these train cars set up. And Terry was there with 3 or 4 other old-time stunt guys. And I just pulled up a chair and listened to them telling stories. Terry sat down and explained to me how a running W stunt with a horse was done and what it sounded like, because he did so many of them. And I mean, I called it a gathering of eagles. But there's so much of this stuff that we can't lose. We can't lose this history. So I kind of been a champion to, when it came to Chaney, I didn't want the history to be lost. And now it's anything I can talk about the old film history. The new stuff doesn't interest me as much.
Something that just struck me, I just rewatched the Kevin Brownlow documentary you were mentioning, Lon Chaney, A Thousand Faces, in which you, as you mentioned, appear prominently. And I watched it with my wife, Debbie, and something hit me that really hasn't before. I already considered Chaney unique in being someone who was a prominent character actor and doing such elaborate makeup and such skilled makeup, as opposed to other names in the industry who are known for makeup, Jack Pierce, William Tuttle, Rick Baker, like that, but mainly behind the camera. I mean, Rick Baker, if he's in front of the camera, he's in an ape suit, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But even apart from that uniqueness on the part of Chaney, it strikes me that thinking of other dramatic actors of that era, Barrymore, Gilbert, Valentino, Ronald Colman, if you see a publicity portrait of them, what you see in that portrait, more often than not, captures the presence that they exude from the screen. I mean, there would be some normal range of emotion, happy, sad, angry, et cetera, et cetera. But you look at just a simple portrait of Lon Chaney, and it doesn't remotely capture the power that he exuded from the screen in a whole range of emotions. And that was just kind of an epiphany for me.
Yeah. Well, most interviewers, when they interviewed him, they said he was a star who looked like a clerk. He wore an old 20 style cap, had glasses, and wore coat and tie and suit and tie or 3-piece suit. He didn't look anything like an actor. He didn't look at all like Douglas Fairbanks. Like you say, you look at the regular portraits of him, and there's, I don't want to say nothing special, but nothing jumps out at you. But you look at a portrait of him as the Marine sergeant and tells to the Marines, or you look at the Hunchback or the Phantom, or you look at the one-eyed ruler in Singapore from Road to Mandalay, or any of those things, and suddenly this guy is alive. And he had the charisma. The camera loved him. Oddly enough, I think he downplayed when they did regular portrait shots. I think he downplayed his personality. However, if you look at early photos of him from like the late teens to, say, pre-Hunchback, obviously some of them are posed, with a stern look or something like that. But there's something there, but not quite there. And in his last contract with MGM, which he signed shortly before doing his only talking picture, he had a clause in there that he would not sit for a regular portrait anymore. If he sat for a portrait shot, it had to be related to the character he was playing in the movie. You look at a series of photos of him as Professor Echo from the Unholy Three Talkie, where he's in the photo gallery there and he's posing with the dummy. My God, he exudes charisma. But you look at him with just his cap and that, and he's like, okay, that's Lon Chaney. It's not like looking at a photo of Cary Grant or John Wayne. They could just look at a camera and there was something there about them. And I think a lot of that was his talent. He held it back, just would let that charisma come out when the cameras were rolling.
And that may be a good segue into jumping back and just talking about his early life and the influences of his upbringing and stage experience that prepared him for working in motion pictures. So can you give kind of a thumbnail for people who have not been exposed to this yet, kind of a thumbnail early biography?
Absolutely. He was born in Colorado Springs, Colorado on April 1st, 1883. His maternal grandparents, the Kennedys, founded Colorado's first school for the deaf and blind in Colorado Springs, and that school is still there to this day. His father was born in Ohio. His father was Frank Chaney. Frank Chaney's grandfather was known as Judge John Chaney. He had been a judge. He wound up serving in the U.S. Congress with a guy named Davy Crockett at the same time. And Frank, he was not born deaf. He lost his hearing at age 3 due to an illness. Lon's mother, Emma, and her brother, Orange, and her other sister, they were all born deaf. And Frank came to Colorado Springs because he had learned the trade of barbering. And that's where he met Emma at the deaf school. And they were married, and they had 4 children. A 5th child died a couple of months after being born. But there was Jonathan, who was the oldest brother, then Lon, then Caroline or Carrie, the sister, and then the brother George. He was the youngest. Lon pretty much said he had a normal childhood, playing games and that. And his father's job as the head barber, while he got some very sizable tips at times, they moved around a lot. They'd never owned property. They rented homes. His mom fell with rheumatoid arthritis, and Lon had to drop out of school to take care of her. And that's where he would communicate to her with sign language and pantomime things going on and taking care of her. He wound up going back to school. He did finish school, but his father also felt he needed to learn a trade, and he learned the trade of carpet laying and wallpaper hanging. And the first Antlers Hotel suffered a severe fire, so they tore it down and they rebuilt it. And when they were rebuilding it, Lon actually laid carpets and hung wallpaper for the second Antlers Hotel. And he remarked in a 1928 interview when he was passing through and stopped that some of his work was still there on the walls and on the carpets. His brother John wound up getting a job in the local opera house, working from prop man to stage manager. So he got Lon a part-time job as a prop boy. And the group formed a kind of amateur theater group, and Lon made his professional acting debut in April of 1902 in a play called The Little Tycoon. He still stayed working at the opera house as a stagehand at that point. But then soon the troupe met some other professional actors, and off they went touring through the countryside, or all the tank towns and small towns, doing sometimes one-night stand. If they were in a town for like 2-3 nights, they had a series of 2 to 4 plays that they could put on. So, they could vary their presentations. And he wound up doing this, and he landed in Oklahoma City in 1905. And lots of times what they would do is they'd hire locals, so they didn't have to carry a whole company. They'd hire local wannabe actors for bit parts. So this young girl by the name of Cleva Creighton auditioned, and she got hired, and she and Lon fell in love. Next thing you know, the following year, their son Creighton told Chaney was born. Lon left the theater company and took a job in a furniture store in Oklahoma City until baby was old enough and they went back out on the road. We have reviews now going all the way to Nova Scotia, to Florida, to Missouri, all sorts of places where, he just toured wherever with various companies, and then landed in California around 1910. And he started working for various companies like the Ferris Hartman Group. He worked for a short season, probably like about 5 or 6 months. Worked with a fella named Roscoe Arbuckle. It did a musical play called The Gingerbread Man. And Roscoe played the Good Fairy. And he was never in vaudeville. I want to stress that. Vaudeville was totally a different entertainment entity than musical comedies. Musical comedies was an actual play with musical and dance numbers. And that's what Lon did. And he hooked up in 1912 in Los Angeles with the Ferris Hartman Group, and they were putting on a new play a week. For 1 week, they'd be showing this play, and during the afternoons, they're rehearsing the next play. Not only did Lon play a part, he was also the stage manager, and he also was the choreographer for all the musical numbers. And Cleva appeared in several of these. And then by 1913, Cleva had become very popular with the nightclub circuit as a singer. Lon's struggle, she became more popular. She's beautiful. She's young. She's got a great voice. She sits with the gentleman in the audience afterwards, and they buy her a drink. And, she became more popular. And Lon's sitting here struggling, holding 3 jobs for one company and not getting very far. So jealousies happened. Cleva was not somebody who should have ever taken a drink. She became an alcoholic. And she was, by 1913, fooling around behind Lon's back, carrying on an affair. It's all in the divorce papers, which I recount in my first book. And one night they had an argument, and that night she walks from Clunes, which was a nightclub that she was working at, walked over to the Majestic Theater, and in the wings of the theater, while Lon was performing on stage, she swallowed a vial of bichloride of mercury. Didn't kill her, but it put an end to her singing career. Of course, the newspapers immediately jumped right on the story, and that pretty much killed Lon's career in the theater in Los Angeles. He was let go by Cobb and Dill at the time. He was working with them, and he wound up going into movies because he had a son to support. So he started working as an extra. There have been unconfirmed reports. There's been nothing I can prove completely that he started working as an extra in 1912. Some people have said, oh, here's a photo, that's him. And it's like, not really. It doesn't really look like him. Maybe, but I don't know. We have no concrete proof. And unless we have concrete proof, I can't say he started in 1912. There's nothing there. Because back then, they wouldn't even want to give actors screen credit unless they get successful. We do know he started working as an extra, and because of his experience with musical comedy, he played various roles, so he was already adept at stage makeup, and he started playing extras, and we know the first known screen credit was a 1913 one-reeler imp comedy called Poor Jake's Demise. Now, here's the interesting thing about Poor Jake's Demise. Within the last, I want to say maybe the last 8 years, might be a little bit longer, but not by much, that movie has shown up.
Really?
Yes. Lon's first known screen credit that we know of, there he is, playing kind of a foppish character in this very exaggerated comedy. But there he is, and he stayed at Universal, partly because of his theater background. That kind of helped him that, well, look, this guy's been a professional actor. We can use him in roles. And he started working for various directors, and he was known with his makeup. Sometimes he would make up the other actors as well. And then by about 1915, he starts working with a husband and wife team called Ida Mae Park and Joseph DeGrassi. And he becomes one of their stock company players. He's like third billed in a lot of the films, sometimes first billed.
Yeah, I was looking, in fact, and thinking, going through your book, The Films of Lon Chaney, and I think the 2 directors that most people who have general familiarity with his career, they associate him with Todd Browning and Wallace Worsley. But then I looked and saw the number of films that he did for Joseph DeGrasse, and I just, okay, wow, that was a very prolific collaboration.
Oh, yeah. And it was tremendous training ground for him because he learned about the camera. He knew what would and wouldn't work for makeup. And he also wound up writing and directing. Well, he directed 6 films, and he also wrote the screenplay for several films. I recently added to my collection, hooray, hooray, a one-sheet poster for The Oyster Dredger, a 1915 film that he directed and wrote. He's not in it, and the poster says produced by Lon Chaney, because back then they wouldn't say directed by, they'd say produced by. The director was the producer at that point. But yeah, he even directed, but he didn't like directing because he wasn't able to carry out what he wanted. And so he kind of went back to acting, and he chose to go back, thankfully, to acting. But he was known to have a hand in directing films. He certainly helped Worsley on The Hunchback, directing that film, with directing some scenes with Betsy Ruth Miller in that. Lon needed a strong director that could control him, because he wasn't always, like many actors, not always their best judge of what worked. You see it as an actor from where you are, whereas a director, you're here by the camera and you see it, and you might see something slightly different. And he just needed a director that would say, Lon, tone that down half a click or a full click, bring that down. Don't need to be that intense. Of course, with Browning, they just got along so great. Another director he worked with that he really liked was Jack Conway, who directed While the City Sleeps and The Unholy Three Talkie. Herbert Brennan he admired a great deal, and he loved Swedish director Victor Seastrom, who he did He Who Gets Slapped in Tower of Lies with, and also Benjamin Christensen. The one director he didn't like was Rupert Julian on Phantom of the Opera. Julian had just come off being given credit for the merry-go-round that von Stroheim had gotten fired from. And the movie did well, and he thought, he was more responsible for the success than von Stroheim. And he and Lon clashed. Julian also had been a bigger name at Universal in the teens as an actor. You might say, he was kind of like a lead star. And Lon wanted a certain way to do the Phantom. He saw it, and it didn't go with what Julian did. And they had some arguments. And finally, at one point, Lon just refused to listen to him. And Charles Van Enger, the cinematographer, told me, he said, I acted as the go-between between Lon and Julian would say, I want him to do this and this and this and this and this. And so I'd go over to Lon and say, Lon, he wants you to do this and this. And he said, Lon would shake his head and he'd say, tell him to go to hell. And Lon, basically the performance of Phantom that you see is Lon Chaney's full interpretation. Oddly enough, it is a movie that in 1924, Lon was looking for new projects after the success of Hunchback. And I have a copy of a telegram that he sent out asking about film rights for Phantom of the Opera. So he's the one that got the film rights to Phantom. But of course, back then, the actors didn't, if they got the rights to a film, they didn't think about how much money can I get for it. It was basically, okay, I paid $500 for the rights. Okay, here's $500 for your rights. That's it. And you got a straight salary, no bit of the profit or anything like that happened years later.
There's a couple of things that come to my mind in terms of Chaney's uniqueness. One, he obviously had a fondness for dual roles. I mean, that's a common thread. Basically, I guess there are two common threads that can be noticed through his films. One is his characters not getting the girl. I mean, and even in some of his most despicable characters, there are moments where you kind of feel for him because they become a little bit emotionally vulnerable at times. So there's that common theme, and the fact that he liked to do dual roles in so many of the pictures. The Blackbird being a variation of that, in that he's playing one character who the character assumes dual roles.
Well, I think a lot of that was from an actor's point of view, being able to play something you normally didn't. And I think also it was his ability to say, what can I do with makeup to help the character? You look at the character in Outside the Law, where he plays the gangster, a really vile gangster, and he plays the Chinese shopkeeper, Ah Wing. You go to A Blind Bargain, probably Chaney's really only horror film, where he plays this doctor who operates on people, and he plays one of the doctor's experiments as this half ape, half man, which I think is a great little makeup he did, and it's oh so simple. And then, of course, we can go to Mr. Wu, where he played the grandfather as at 70 or 80, and then as a 100-year-old grandfather, and then as the grandson in two different variations of makeup age-wise. I think it was just from the acting point of view, it was fun. It was, hey, let me play this. He didn't go out of his way to find roles like that. I think if the script called for it, the story called for it, and there was a possibility, well, why would you want to hire an older actor here to play Mr. Wu, the grandfather? You can hear Thalberg saying, why do that when we can hire Chaney, have him play both roles, and look at the publicity the movie will get. And matter of fact, in Mr. Wu, as the opening titles go, there's a title there that says the characters of Grandfather Wu and Mr. Wu are both played by Lon Chaney. From an actor's point of view, it's a way of stretching yourself and doing something that you don't always get a chance to. Now, Chaney played a dual role going back to, I think the movie was Alas and Alack, but don't hold me to it, where he plays a fisherman, and then he plays this kind of fantasy hunchback character within a seashell, around a seashell. Oddly enough, he didn't play dual roles that much in his days at Universal. He might play, like in A Mother's Atonement, you see him as the younger man in his 20s, maybe early 30s, in flashback scenes, and then you see him as the older man with a big beard and that. So that he would do. But in the Universal period, I would say, he doesn't really play that many dual roles.
He was known so much for the makeup, but the other thing that he was amazing with was the things that he would do with his overall body to execute a role. Of course, the Miracle Man being one of the most notable examples. But for me, it's The Penalty.
Oh, yes.
And he doesn't do any unusual makeup on his face for that one. He's just, got his hard, normal look. But man, what he did to achieve the effect of being a double amputee just astounds me.
It's still a great film. It's one that anybody interested in watching Lon Chaney, watch that movie. You want to see acting. As you said, he played a double amputee. He strapped his legs behind him, put him in leather stumps. In the documentary, if folks don't have the Lon Chaney collection DVD of Ace of Hearts, The Unknown, and
the London After Midnight reconstruction, and then Laugh Clown Laugh is in there.
Chaney documentary in there. And we did a thing on camera showing the stumps and showing how the costume was made, which was all Lon's idea of how to hide the legs. Now, there are some scenes in that where it's a close-up shot, chest high, that I know Lon is not wearing the stumps by the way he's walking. You can tell he's walking on his knees. His legs aren't bent back. So there's a couple of times, and I can understand doing that. The reports were that they'd do a scene and he'd get out of it and have to wait about 10 minutes to get his legs massaged, get the blood flowing. And they also had a dress dummy made up for his exact height that they would put in place when they were rehearsing the scene and lining it up for the camera. So Lon didn't have to stand there with his legs bound behind him. It's a tremendous movie. And like you say, The Miracle Man, when I first saw it as a kid, I was like, holy moly, what this guy did. And as I got older and being around actors and that, then I started watching, and you watch that healing scene in The Miracle Man, and it's all acting. It's just the way he pretends to move that leg out, it thrusts out in a certain way, or putting his shoulder in joint. It's all just this careful choreograph of movement of his body. Now, I want to go back real quick. One thing most people don't know about, Lon was an exceptional dancer. Of course, going with musical comedy, he staged all the dance numbers in that. And I ran into a gentleman one time who was an extra on one of his films, and he told me, he said, between scenes, Chaney would have the set musicians play, and he'd say he'd dance a little bit for exercise. And he says his dancing was as graceful as Fred Astaire.
Well, that actually jumps me forward a bit. In terms of the biofilm, Man of a Thousand Faces, I'm wondering about, on a scale of 1 to 10, maybe 1 being night and day and 10 being something that has not yet been made in terms of faithfulness to the facts, where it falls on that scale. Specifically, I'm just curious about the scenes where it shows him performing, doing his music hall performances, if there is enough documentation to have a sense that those were the types of acts that he did, or if it's pure speculation. Because you see some of Cagney doing, you see a few Yankee Doodle Dandy moves in there for one thing, but I'm just wondering how close that might have been.
People have said that Lon was an eccentric dancer. So you can easily see where he would fit in with the comment about Fred Astaire. They put the musical numbers in, which oddly enough, the 2 musical dance numbers in Man of a Thousand Faces, that music was written by James Cagney. He composed it. Did Lon do those kind of dances on stage? No, I've never found anything. He wasn't a solo act. See, that's where I think people get the impression he was in vaudeville, because he comes on stage, does a solo act. He was part of a musical comedy. So yes, he would have danced. I mean, my God, he did a lot of Cohen's musicals in 1912 when he was here in Los Angeles. God, I would love to see some of that. He did a lot of dancing, but I think it was more eccentric. I think it was more theatrically choreographed. It wasn't individual acts like we see in the movie. That being said, I have a hard time criticizing the movie because it opened my life to Lon Chaney. It changed my life. So I have a very soft spot for the film. Are there things that aren't accurate? Of course. Some things had to be changed because people were still alive, so you couldn't get sued. Universal, I think they tended to want to focus more on the unhappy marriage than focusing on Lon's ability as an actor.
The gold rush is over. You're quitting Lates tomorrow. You're not leaving my son in the hands of a stranger.
Lon, she's experienced, takes care of children all the time. And what's wrong with my wanting to do something? Lots of women have careers.
Creighton is more important than a career.
There's time for both. They liked me tonight. And I like their liking. It's what I want to do.
My all-time flat-out favorite scene, aside from the one my dad is in, is when he's coming to work as an extra and he makes himself up as the East Indian sailor with the scar.
4 Lascars, 2 with scars.
Lascars? What's that?
East Indian sailors. Me.
Now, the makeup I'm not thrilled with, but that was Lon Chaney. That, to me, caught the essence of Lon Chaney the best.
Hey, what's your name, fella?
Lon Chaney. Chain. What are you trying to do? Be a one-man crew on this ship?
You heard him, Joe. He'd be looking for this scar.
And I talked with director Joseph Pevney about it, and he loved that scene. He said to me that was really something. And ironically, in that scene, there's an extra in the background by the name of John George, who appeared in several films with Chaney, including The Unknown, Outside the Law, Road to Mandalay, and goes back to appearing in films with Chaney to 1916. Joseph Pevney told me, he said several people throughout the making of the film came up to him and said, I worked with Lon Chaney. And I wouldn't be surprised because there were so many people still alive back then that had started out in the silent era. But there's this guy who co-starred with Chaney in one of his great films, The Unknown, and there he is in the background. So that sequence of Cagney making himself up, I dearly, dearly love. It's a very special scene to me, not just because of what it captured of Chaney, but also as a makeup artist. And it's funny is sometimes when I would have an elaborate makeup and I'm doing it, I would start humming that music from that sequence while I was putting the makeup on the actor, kind of get into the mood. It's an okay film.
I'd seen it years ago, and then I just rewatched it, and it struck me this time that I was really surprised that Cagney wasn't up for an Oscar for it, because he does give a very powerful performance.
As does Cecilia Lovosky as his mother. She should have gotten an Oscar nomination because this woman plays the whole thing doing sign language. Also, Frank Skinner's score is just tremendous, just wonderful. I mean, pulls at the heartstrings at the right moment. It's just, I can't tell you how many times I sat in front of the TV recording the score of the movie in various scenes and wore out. I must have wore out about 3 tapes in the course of 20 years playing it all the time until I finally got one on a CD. It just, to me, I like the movie very much. Is it great? Is it accurate? It's okay. It's better than Valentino, the movie with was it Anthony Dexter, I think. Certainly better than Pearls of Pauline with Betty Hutton, or the Buster Keaton story with Donald O'Connor. Yeah, I know. That's painful to watch.
Yeah, see, that was originally going to be my number one. I thought, well, but then there is Night and Day. Yeah, going back to the makeup again, and you're talking about that, I'm just wondering, in your career as a makeup artist, are there any specific techniques that you utilize that came from Chaney?
Yes.
Anything unique?
One, well, not unique, but it's at Disney, the same was always, what would Walt do? Well, we were doing the pilot of Magnum, and originally writers are great with this because they come up with these ideas, not knowing how it's going to be done, thinking that you'll fix it. You know, you'll come up with the idea as a makeup artist. But Tom Selleck had to have a bullet wound in the shoulder and an exit wound in the back. Happens in Vietnam, and it's an old scar. And in the opening of the pilot, he's rubbing it, and it does a quick flashback to the Vietnam stuff. Well, at that time in 1980, we didn't have the silicone pieces and things like that we do now. We could not use foam rubber piece because the minute it would hit water, it would just swell up, because he's seen swimming out of the ocean coming up on the beach and that. So it's like, well, we can't do that. And the entry wound and the exit wound, it was like, oh, God, this is going to be a lot of work. So I said to the other makeup artists, we both kind of agreed that it should be an entry wound and maybe a scar on the shoulder blade. Like they had to open him up here in the shoulder blade to get pieces out, and there's a bullet wound. And my coworker said, that's great. How are we going to do it? I don't know. You know, and we're thinking about stuff, and it's, you know, we went up to the makeup lab and we looked around at some old bullet wound hits and that. Most of them were foam rubber. So it was like, no, we can't do this. We have no idea. And of course, one of the producers comes by and goes, hey, how's that working with the bullet wound for Tom? You got that figured out? Oh, yeah, no problem. It's locked in. Don't worry about it. We had not a clue. I mean, I had not a clue. Since I was doing Tom, it fell to me. We're about maybe 3 days from when it has to work. We're shooting at Universal at the time. You know, the pressure's on, and I'm like, what the heck? You know, you're sitting here thinking, well, we tried this. We tried John Chambers' Scar'em, which was kind of like a rubber cement type of thing. It didn't really work well. It was hard to, for a one-shot deal, it would be great. It was like a rubber cement type glue, and you pushed it out of a tube. You could kind of make it work for a one-time thing, but to do it day after day after day or several days of shooting and be consistent and have a continuity to it, ain't going to work. So we're like, oh, what are we going to do? So I'm looking in my makeup case, and I thought to myself, what would Lon have done? And I start looking in my case, and I see this one bottle, and I pull it out. I opened up my shirt, pulled the shirt back, and did a little painting. And then I took this stuff was called non-flexible collodion. And it's what they use on fighters when they get a hit on the eye. When you put it on the skin, it draws the skin together, you know, puckers the skin. Put it a couple of coats on, and wow, that looks pretty good as a bullet wound. So then I opened my shirt more, and I did a little makeup here on the shoulder blade and on the top of the shoulder here, the collarbone net. Did a scar and did a couple of things, and it looked really darn good. So I called my friend over, the other makeup artist, Pete, and I said, hey, Pete, what do you think of this? And he said, yeah, that'll work. He said, what is it? I said, it's non-flexible collodion. It'll hold up. We can spray it with a fixative spray. It's not going to go anywhere. So we went to the producer, Don Belisario, and the director, and said, look, when you got a minute, we want to show you what we got in mind. I said, okay. And I pull my shirt off and show it to them. And they're looking at it. They go, wow, that's great. That'll work terrific. So the first day, we're shooting on a stage for Magnum's guest house. And I put the thing on, and Tom Connors, the first AD, was there, and he saw the scar, and he went, man, I wish we could have done that to me. And he pulled his pant leg up, and he had a suture, scar from sutures, work on his leg, on his knee. And it looked just like what I just did on Tom. And I was the hero of the day. It worked perfectly. It was easy to apply. We never had a problem with it. But that to me was all Lon's handiwork came to me, because I simply looked at my case and I just thought, what would Chaney do if he was here and he had to do this? And I saw that bottle of non-flexible collodion, and it was like, yes, that's it.
That's cool. So getting to the end of his career, his only talkie before he died was the remake of Unholy Three. It's been a while since I've seen either one of them, but it seems to me that the silent version has some advantage. For instance, the way the courtroom scene plays out near the end, you couldn't pull off in a talkie, so that had to be changed in terms of the ventriloquism and how it was used. The myth of a ventriloquist actually throwing their voice was not gonna work the way it was portrayed. And also in the silent version, Harry Earls is easier to understand.
That was, Harry had a heavy accent, and the sound.
Yeah, the technology wasn't really there to be able to carry his voice well. It was not his fault. And I think had it not been for the technological limitation, I don't think the dialect would have been that difficult.
No.
You're afraid of Echo. Maybe you're afraid of me too. Let's see. Boo!
Oh, shut up.
One of the things with the Unholy Three, one of the things with the silent that works well is the introduction of the ape character, which in the silent version of the Unholy Three, it was really a chimpanzee in a scaled down set. When you go to the Unholy Three talkie, a friend of mine says, I don't get it. All I know is it's 1930 and there's a gorilla in a bird store.
We've got a gorilla for sale. Godzilla gorilla for sale.
And there's this gorilla, which was actually Charlie Gamora, who later became a makeup artist, playing this ape. And Lon, as the old woman, is going, get back there, get back. He got this. I think with sound, it kind of made it a little bit harder for some people watching it to accept the reality. Whereas, as like in the silent version, when the Hector character goes up on the witness stand and he's told to silently mouth the Lord's Prayer and Lon throws his voice, it's more believable. It does work. The gorilla in that silent version, or the chimp, works better. But the Unholy Three, the talkie, certainly there was no problem with Lon's voice.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you. Now, folks, if you'll just gather around a little closer now. Come right in a little closer. That's it. That's fine. That's fine, folks. Now, then, if you'll be real quiet, I'll see if I can get the little boy to say something.
People say, well, what would his career at MGM be like? And I said, well, here's the question to ask. What would have Wallace Beery's career been like at MGM if Lon lived longer? Because I certainly think a majority of the roles that Beery wound up playing throughout the early 30s, Lon could have played Beery's part in Grand Hotel and Dinner at 8. He could have played the champ, be a slightly different caricature. Could he have done Min and Bill with Marie Dressler? Well, I think so. It would have been different. I mean, there's so many things that Beery did that you look at it and you go, oh, this is a Chaney part. I would love to have seen Chaney get into musicals. God, I would have loved to have seen that. Just one musical would have been terrific. See him sing and dance. Oh my gosh, that would be something. Certainly his career was not going to be limited. Would it be limited makeup-wise? Well, in the sense that you probably couldn't put certain things in your mouth, like fake teeth and that, in order to be heard, unless he was playing a character like, let's say, the Hunchback. Yeah, he could have done the Hunchback as a sound film because Well, by the time they did it with Lawton, that dubbing was pretty easy. But he certainly could have played a variety of roles, which he was already doing. I mean, if you really look at his MGM films, any one of them could have made a great talkie. Would Mr. Wu be a great talkie? I don't know, but I mean, it could be. They could see him, had he lived long enough, playing a role, a supporting role in The Good Earth with Paul Muni. You know, there's just so much that he could have done, and that's such the frustrating thing, that he had this career and it was going to go. He was going to do things because, you know, he had Thalberg backing him. And I mean, my God, you can't get better than Thalberg as a producer. And the potential of what he could have done, it's just amazing. And thank God he did the one talkie. I am so thankful he did the one talkie, because at least we know what he sounded like. But gosh, what a loss. What a loss.
Now listen, you come in with me on this, and I'll make you rich, plenty rich. Now you see, my plan is so simple, so ridiculous, that it scares you. From tonight on, we disappear. They'll look for the midget, but there won't be no midget. They'll find the fingerprints of the echo, there'll be no echo. It sounds kind of creepy.
It's unholy.
That's us. The unholy three. Understand? From tonight on, we fade out. There'll be no Hercules, no Tweedledee, no Echo. We just fade out.
Of all the films of his that are lost, which is actually most of the ones that he did, what about 2/3 of the ones that he did are considered lost?
Close, yeah.
Which are at the top of your list that you hope would be discovered? I know the popular choice is London After Midnight, but
yeah. Honestly, a very small portion of Thunder surface. I wound up in a film auction belonging to the silent movie theater. When the second owner had been killed, they sold everything off. And I bid on a lot that had about 2 minutes worth of Thunder, which is in the documentary. Subsequently, turns out Library of Congress had other footage from Thunder, coupled with Lon in it. So Thunder is one I would really like to see from a makeup point of view, story point of view. I would love to see Tower of Lies that he did with Victor Seastrom. Again, as a makeup, he ages his character from a young man to an old man, and just see the performance. London After Midnight, I'm like, yeah, if it shows up, fine. I think because it's been so overhyped as a lost film that it could be the greatest silent film made, and people will still go, they're disappointed. I would rather see Treasure Island, where he played, we forgot to mention that about the double character, dual role, playing Pew and Mary. I would love to see that. I would love to see A Blind Bargain.
That's at the top of my list, Blind Bargain.
I would love to see that. I'd love to see one of the films he directed at Universal. So there's a lot out there. Will they show? Oh boy, we're at a point now. The film stock of nitrate is so dangerous. And unless it's stored in the best possible condition, it'll eventually turn to goo and dust. You know, time is against us. But then again, there was the movie Triumph. 3 out of 5 reels was found, about 8 years ago? No, around 1999, 2000 was found in the LA area. Some gentleman had been a projectionist and had saved the reels. And there were 2 other reels, but they were decomposed. And these were the original prints. So the titles had a yellow tint to it. Night Scenes had blue tint to it. So it showed up, it's been transferred, and it's out there. So you just never know. I will never say never. I will never say, it's never going to show up. But I do say that time is really against us.
Yeah, I guess another one that I only just, again, in going through your book, realized, because it was one of the genres I was thinking, man, I wonder, why Chaney didn't do one of these. But he actually did do a Pathé serial called Daredevil Jack. And so I think that would be fascinating to see him in the context of a serial.
Yeah. Oh, hey, I'll be greedy. I want to see all the Chaney films that are lost.
Yeah, sure. Why not?
That'll keep me busy for a while.
Yeah. So let me now come to the question that I ask everybody who I have on as a guest, and that is if you would share with us your most memorable movie-going experience.
Oh boy. Most memorable movie experience. Mary Poppins.
Mary Poppins.
Mary Poppins, without a doubt.
Okay.
I must think 5 or 6 times and wore out the LP on it. It was just so magical, so wonderful. It's the best thing Walt Disney ever did because it combined his animation, his live action storytelling, and audio animatronics. And it just, you can't walk out of a theater not humming one of the many songs, if not all of them. An interesting thing about Disney films, they all remind you at the end that your family is okay. You can start off with a father who's a banker in Mary Poppins. It doesn't really pay much attention to the kids. That's the nanny's job. Mama is busy getting votes for women. They're kind of absent. And so they're hell on wheels for the nanny. And then Mary Poppins shows up. And Mary Poppins, they just fall in love with, as the audience does. And she teaches them that this cough medicine isn't bad. It tastes good. And dance with penguins and ride merry-go-round horses and win the Derby. And she makes them go with their father to the bank. And he wants to give the tuppence to the bird woman to feed the birds. And the old man, played by Dick Van Dyke, which wasn't planned, by the way, until Walt saw Dick doing a comedy skit in between scenes as an old man and said, I want you to play old Mr. Banks. And he steals the money and causes a run on the bank. The father loses his job. And after he loses his job, what does the father do? He realizes what Mary Poppins said was right. And he goes off singing A Spoonful of Sugar, and he mends the boy's kite that had been damaged in the beginning of the film. And they come together, and the mother says, a proper kite needs a proper tail. And she gives that banner that she's been wearing around herself saying votes for women and puts it on the tail. So she's giving part of that to the kids. And the kids have to tearfully say goodbye to Mary Poppins. But Mary Poppins has united the family and brought them back. And they go to the park and they fly the kite. And Mary Poppins just goes off. Mary Poppins is an angel, and she came to do a job. And you look in every one of Walt's movies, the family might have a slight problem. The Parent Trap, that darn cat, whatever it is. But at the end, the family comes back together. The family is assured. The family ties are assured and taken care of. And that was a great thing that Walt did. I mean, in any of his films, animated or whatever. But Mary Poppins for me was like, wow. I never saw anything like it before, ever. Nobody had it. And it was just magical. Just truly, truly magical. I feel it's Disney's greatest movie.
All right. Now, I shouldn't let you get away before we talk about, just briefly, you've written books other than about Lon Chaney. You dipped into some Westerns, and you mentioned earlier your interest in John Ford. So you've written one book already that encompassed, at least one that is immediately springing to mind. But you've got another one coming out soon, and it's available now for pre-order on Amazon. You want to just throw in a little plug for that real quick?
Well, it's called The Cavalry Trilogy, John Ford, John Wayne, and the Making of Three Classic Westerns. It's about the making of John Ford's Cavalry Trilogy, Fort Apache, She Wore Yellow Ribbon, and Rio Grande. And that'll be out next March. I'm very, very pleased with it because there's 3 films I really love. I love writing about John Ford. I went to his funeral. I cried when they wheeled his coffin out. That was the Irish sentimentalist in me. And I remember walking out. We were in the Blessed Sacrament Catholic Church in Hollywood on Sunset. I mean, if somebody wanted to kill Hollywood that day, they should have attacked that church because everybody. And I remember I'm walking out and I'm walking down the aisle, and 3 people could walk down the aisle. And I'm 16 and I'm just sobbing, because I saw John Wayne walk by and he's crying and I just lost it. And I look over And to my left, I look at William Wyler, the director of so many great films, and Charlton Heston. Both of them did Ben-Hur. And Wyler looks at me and he just nods like, I understand. And Heston gave me a quick nod as if to say, yeah, we get it. I understand how you're feeling. Yeah, it was, Ford is a great person to write about. I enjoy writing about his films. Quickly, I wrote a book called Code of Honor, which is out of print. I'm kind of hoping to try to see, because I got new material to add to it. It's about the making of High Noon, Shane, and the Searchers. And my dad plays the owner of the saloon in High Noon, who gets punched by Gary Cooper. So when
did we mention your dad's name? I know we've talked about him, but
Larry Blake.
Yeah, Larry Blake. So if we didn't until now, then
movie database. He was in a lot of stuff. Then I wrote a book about the 8 films on the gunfight at the OK Corral, and I've written 2 books on Theodore Roosevelt. One is called The Cowboy President, about his time in the West, and the other one is called Go West, Mr. President. It's about his 1903 Great Loop Tour of 21 states, and kind of an unofficial campaign incident. In that book, I uncovered something no other biographer wrote about. They may have found it and for editing purposes had to junk it, but I found an assassination attempt that was thwarted within hours of happening in Walla Walla, Washington. And right now, I'm very slowly working on, tentatively titled 72 Hours to Appomattox, about the last 72 hours before Lee surrenders to Grant and ends the Civil War. But that's a lot of work involved, a lot of reading.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah. So I don't know if the book is going to happen or not. I'm making stabs at it. It's a slow work, but a lot of, like I said, a lot of information to go through and try to make it understandable, Yeah, my old high school English teacher, she must be rolling in her grave at Forest Lawn, Glendale, because I was the worst English student you could have.
I can empathize with that. Well, it's been a great pleasure talking to you about, the various subjects we got into, Lon Chaney, of course, being central. It's something I've really looked forward to, and I'm glad we finally had a chance to do it. And possibly down the road, maybe one of these other topics or books, we can get together again and have a similar chat. So,
anytime. Enjoyed myself, and it's just fun. I love talking about this stuff, as you may know, because it's what I love. It was my life, and it's something don't get a chance to talk to about that often.
That's true. Once again, my guest has been Michael F. Blake, author, film historian, makeup artist, and actor. Thank you, Michael, for joining us on Movie Nights and Matinees. And thanks again to those of you who've listened in on our discussion. I appreciate you hanging in there. Since episode 10 was short, I suppose it makes sense that this one would run long. And see, I told you in the last episode I'd be back with a great guest. And there are more to come. Just be sure to hit the follow or subscribe button wherever you listen to make sure that you don't miss any. A special thanks to Donnie C., who recently posted a very nice review, which you can see if you visit the Movie Nights and Matinees website. That's also a place where you can leave comments, ask questions, make suggestions, or just wander around looking at things. On the screening room page, you'll find links for ordering Lon Chaney movies, for instance, as well as ones discussed in prior episodes. And on the bookshelf page are links to Michael Blake's books on Lon Chaney, as well as other film topics, including his forthcoming book on the Cavalry Trilogy. And as always, please follow Donnie C's example and leave a rating and a review wherever you listen. Well, join me again in a couple of weeks for episode 12. You might want to pack a lunch and make sure your canteen is full.
You can close the gates now.